Hi, this is NextGen Picks. I didn't think this would matter when I started testing screens, but it actually does. You drop $2,000 on a premium 4K panel, and 36 months later, the picture still looks absolutely flawless. But the TV itself is practically headed for the dumpster. Why? Because hitting the home button to load Netflix takes 4 agonizing seconds, and the volume indicator violently stutters across the screen. You aren't replacing a dead display, you're replacing a perfectly good piece of glass that a manufacturer choked death with cheap processor RAM and a bloated operating system. Now you're probably thinking, wait, doesn't a TV's value just depend on whether it's OLED or mini LED? Not exactly. If you want a screen that won't make you irrationally angry by 2029 and will actually command a decent resale price on Facebook Marketplace when you eventually upgrade, you have to look at the silicon under the hood. Today, we are tearing down the 3 brands that actually hold their value: Sony, LG, and Samsung. And the data on the second one completely surprised me. I buy these units out of pocket to run long-term thermal and UI degradation tests, meaning no brand gets to look at this script before you see it. If that kind of independent fine print reading helps you avoid a $1,000 mistake, hitting subscribe NextGen Picks directly funds the next teardown. Let's pull apart the first brand that actually respects your money. Most people walk into a big box store, stare at a wall of hyper-saturated demo footage running at maximum luminance, and make a decision based entirely on which glass rectangle burns their retinas the fastest. That is exactly how the retail industry wants you to shop. They want you completely ignoring the reality that a modern television is essentially a giant fragile smartphone permanently mounted to your drywall. You aren't just buying a display panel, you are buying a system on chip, a thermal management solution, and a power board. And the power board is where the hidden murder happens. I keep coming back to this, and I'm not sure why it bothers me so much. Manufacturers will confidently charge you $2,500 for a flagship model, but then solder 85°C rated capacitors on the main board instead of 105° caps to save literally 14 cents per unit on the assembly line. Fast forward 36 months after baking inside a razor-thin plastic shell mounted flush against a wall, those cheap caps swell up, the TV clicks, the standby light blinks red, and it never turns on again. It completely dies. That's the hidden reality of the consumer electronics market right now, where the internal component that costs the brand the most money is the exact thing they quietly downgrade to protect their quarterly profit margins. You interact with the operating system every single day. Most budget brands ship their TVs with a pathetic 2 GB of RAM and 8 GB of storage. When the TV is fresh out of the box, it feels totally fine, but after 3 mandatory firmware updates and 2 years of background app bloat, hitting the home button takes 4 agonizing seconds. That daily UI friction breeds absolute resentment. Sony runs Google TV. While no smart interface is perfect, Google's underlying architecture combined with Sony's RAM allocation means that in 48 months, the core navigation won't randomly freeze when you try to switch from Netflix to your PlayStation. A fast interface today is a usable interface in 5 years, and ensuring that requires expensive silicon. I almost didn't include this part, but it actually matters more than I expected. The physical layout of your room dictates the survival of these components. Placing a high-end OLED directly above a functioning fireplace is a guaranteed death sentence for the panel. The radiant heat destroys the organic compounds, voiding the warranty and accelerating thermal degradation by roughly 50%. It is the single fastest way to waste your money. Zoom out now. If you try to sell a 3-year-old budget TCL or Vizio on Craigslist, you are getting pennies on the dollar assuming anyone even messages you in the first place. But high-end models, they command a massive premium used, and there is a very specific engineering reason for that. Certain brands refuse to play the margin-cutting game. Look closely at the Sony A95L QOLED and their new Bravia 9 Mini LED. Sony doesn't actually manufacture the raw glass panels for these units. They buy the glass from Samsung Display and LG. But what Sony does next dictates why a 5-year-old Bravia still feels snappy and responsive. They wrap that outsourced panel in a heavily reinforced metal chassis, Attach massive passive aluminum heat sinks to the back of the OLED to pull heat away from the fragile pixels, and run the entire data pipeline through their proprietary XR processing engine. Moving a 65-inch Sony requires 2 people and a prayer because they don't hollow out the rear casing to save on international shipping weight. Heavy casing reduces chassis flex and prevents the panel from snapping during a local move. It hurts instantly. If you're already reaching for your phone to check the price, yes, the A95L launched at around $3,299 for the 65-inch variant, which is incredibly frustrating for anyone on a normal budget. I know. That sounds like I'm contradicting myself by calling a $3,000 TV a smart value for retaining its worth. Hear me out. You are paying the infamous Sony tax, but that premium buys you an out-of-the-box colorimetry calibration that is so mathematically accurate, it practically negates the need for a $300 professional ISF calibration. I ran the Bravia 9 through Kalman color matching software on my test bench, and the delta errors were virtually undetectable right out of the cardboard box. Plus, Sony's architecture uses true 10-bit processing, avoiding the cheap 8-bit plus FRC dithering that causes massive, blocky banding artifacts when you watch dark compressed streaming content. It smooths out the gradient transitions in skies and shadows perfectly. And if you have a wall of windows, you care about the anti-reflective coating tier. Sony uses a moth eye style diffusion layer on the Bravia 9 that scatters direct sunlight without significantly crushing the perceived contrast ratio. Cheap anti-glare screens are usually just a hazy matte plastic film. Compromises still exist. Only including 2 full-bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports is a massive oversight for anyone trying to plug in a PlayStation 5, an Xbox Series X, and an EARC soundbar simultaneously without buying an external switcher. This brings up a massive failure point most buyers completely ignore: EARC handshake stability. On cheaper TVs with low-tier MediaTek chips, the HDMI audio return channel slowly drifts out of sync. Your soundbar will randomly disconnect, forcing you to hard reboot the TV just to get audio back. Sony's HDMI board implementation is rock solid. When you turn the TV on, the audio system wakes up exactly when it's supposed to. I spent way too long testing this. My family has concerns about how many times I powered on and off a soundbar last week just to check the millisecond sync drift, but it highlighted something else. Sony still gives you a highly tactile backlit premium remote control that operates on reliable RF and IR frequencies. They don't force you to use a cheap Bluetooth wand that constantly drops its connection and requires replacing AA batteries every 3 weeks. It's a small detail, but it reflects an engineering culture that assumes you will own this object for a decade. Stop buying specs. I tested the Bravia side by side with a Hisense U8, and within the first 10 minutes, I realized Hisense pushes raw peak brightness numbers that completely wash out the image fidelity. Actually, I need to clarify that. Hisense pushes peak brightness on a tiny 2% window for a fraction of a second, whereas Sony focuses on sustained full-screen brightness. It's a massive difference when you're watching a daytime football game in a sunlit living room. The Sony maintains the green of the turf without dimming, while the budget panel hits a thermal wall and aggressively darkens the entire screen to prevent the LEDs from melting. The marketing team earned their bonus on that peak brightness trick. I'll give them that. It is wildly misleading to quote a Knight's measurement that only applies to a single flash of an explosion in a 2-hour movie, while the rest of the film looks incredibly muted. Let me ask, am I crazy for thinking spending $2,299 on a flagship is a better financial decision than spending $1,500 on a mid-tier panel that you have to replace in 3 years? Because the Wi-Fi module died? Drop your setup in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you're running, how old it is, and what the first thing to break was, because the patterns I see in my testing lab don't always match the weird edge case failures you guys experience in a house with 3 kids and a dog that sleeps on the media console. Now, here's where it gets weird. If Sony represents uncompromising processing and build quality, the next brand represents something entirely different. They figured out a way to practically eliminate the fear of OLED burn-in and attached a warranty to it that completely wrecks the secondary market depreciation curve. Remember what I said earlier about the Sony A95L using heavy aluminum plates to pull heat away from the organic pixels? LG watched the industry freak out about burn-in over the last decade and decided to absolutely weaponize their thermal management. That brings us to the LG G4 and G6 series. This isn't just a screen upgrade. This is a massive shift in how you calculate depreciation on a high-end appliance. When you buy a flagship G series, LG includes a 5-year panel warranty that explicitly covers burn-in. That single piece of paper completely wrecks the secondary market curve for every other brand. If you list a 4-year-old LG G series on a used marketplace, buyers know they still have 12 months of factory protection left on the most expensive component in the chassis. It commands respect. The original buyer isn't eating the full cost of technological obsolescence, allowing them to recoup hundreds of dollars more than someone trying to offload an out-of-warranty budget display that might suffer a catastrophic backlight failure tomorrow. But that's not even the part I wanted to talk about when it comes to the G series. The real engineering magic is the micro-lens array technology. LG essentially placed billions of microscopic convex lenses over the OLED pixels to focus the scattered light directly forward toward your seating position. By doing this, they pushed the sustained brightness past 800 nits on a 100% white window without driving the organic compounds harder or generating extra heat. Wait, let me explain that better. Instead of forcing the engine to work harder and burn out faster, they just changed the optics to stop wasting the light firing sideways inside the glass. It is brilliantly simple and drastically reduces the chances of early pixel failure. But the G series has a massive physical quirk. It does not come with a stand in the box. LG designed it to mount perfectly flush against drywall using a custom recessed bracket. If you rent an apartment and cannot drill massive anchor bolts into the studs, you have to buy an aftermarket Visa pedestal that completely ruins the aesthetic profile. If you're already reaching for your wallet thinking the cheaper LG C5 is the obvious alternative, hold on. The C series is the undisputed sweet spot for 90% of buyers, specifically because it includes a standard pedestal stand and features the exact same 4 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports for 120 Hz console gaming. It runs hotter. The C5 completely lacks the MLA hardware and the massive physical heatsink found in the G series, meaning it runs noticeably dimmer in a sunlit room and is far more susceptible to image retention if you leave a static HUD from a video game on the screen for 8 straight hours. When I had the C5 on my test bench for 2 weeks, the thing that actually got to me was how aggressively the glossy screen reflected the single floor lamp I had sitting in the corner of the room. In pitch black, it looks flawless. At 2 in the afternoon with the blinds open, you are basically staring into a black mirror, watching your own reflection try to decipher shadow detail in a dark movie scene. Fast forward 6 months into owning an LG though, and you realize something spectacular about their firmware strategy. LG recently launched the WebOS Renew program. They guarantee 5 years of operating system upgrades. That means a 2026 model will receive the 2030 UI architecture. That completely eliminates the forced obsolescence cycle where Netflix stops working because the software is too old to support modern digital rights management protocols. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Samsung sells more televisions than anyone else on the planet, and their S90F QD OLED is a masterclass in aggressive pricing. You can routinely find the 65 in S90F hovering around 1,799s. It uses quantum dot technology to deliver color volume that objectively embarrasses standard OLEDs when displaying highly saturated reds and greens at high peak brightness. That spec sheet reads like a dating profile. It looks incredibly impressive until you meet it in person and realize half the promises don't align with your actual lifestyle. My data showed an absolute disaster when it comes to the daily user interface experience. Samsung's Tizen OS has devolved into a heavily monetized, ad-injected maze. To change an HDMI input, you often have to navigate past 3 rows of sponsored content for streaming services you don't even subscribe to NextGen Pix. The input lag just navigating the settings menu to adjust the backlight is completely unacceptable for a premium display. And this is the part that genuinely frustrates me. Samsung stubbornly refuses to pay the licensing fee for Dolby Vision, backing their own HDR10 Plus standard instead. It punishes the buyer. If you have spent the last 5 years building a massive digital library of 4K movies on Apple TV or Vudu, practically all of them are mastered in Dolby Vision. When you plug your Apple TV into a Samsung S90F, the signal defaults back to base HDR10. You lose the dynamic frame-by-frame metadata that perfectly maps the brightness of the scene to the exact capabilities of the panel. You are intentionally nerfing your own movie collection just because a multi-billion-dollar corporation refuses to play nice with Dolby. I know half of you will completely disagree with this take. Many. Enthusiasts claim the color punch of Samsung's QD OLED hardware completely outweighs the lack of Dolby Vision and the messy Tizen interface. They argue you can just buy a $50 streaming stick and bypass the terrible TV software entirely. I strongly argue that spending nearly $2,000 on a display only to immediately require an external box to fix the manufacturer's software incompetence is an anti-consumer practice we shouldn't tolerate. Does having to buy a dedicated Apple TV 4K or Nvidia Shield immediately after dropping $2,000 on a flagship screen feel acceptable to you, or is that a massive failure by the manufacturer? Before you even worry about burn-in, you have to survive the initial unboxing. There is a deeply guarded industry secret called the panel lottery. Manufacturers save millions of dollars by accepting a wider tolerance for what they consider a passable display on the assembly line. When you buy a 65-inch screen, there is a very real chance you will fire up a hockey game and see vertical gray banding running down the white ice. That is called the dirty screen effect, or DSE. It happens because the internal diffusion layers aren't perfectly uniform. On premium Sony and LG G series models, the quality control tolerance for 5% gray uniformity is incredibly strict, meaning fewer bad panels make it into retail boxes. On heavily discounted mid-tier models across all brands, the manufacturers know you likely won't notice the banding until the return window expires. You aren't just paying for features, you are paying for the manufacturer to actually inspect the glass before they ship it. Okay, let's bring this back to your actual living room environment. If you have a massive wall of windows and you watch sports at 2 in the afternoon, you shouldn't be buying an OLED anyway. You should be looking at the Samsung QN95F Mini LED. Instead of organic pixels, it uses a massive grid of thousands of tiny LED backlights pushing thousands of nits of brightness through an incredibly aggressive anti-reflective coating. It literally overpowers the sun without risking burn-in from a static scoreboard. I almost ignored this detail during testing, and that would have been a mistake. The QN95F has a hidden trade-off that gamers discover way too late. When you activate the game mode to drop the input latency for your Xbox Series X down to 5 milliseconds, the processor drastically reduces the complexity of its local dimming algorithm. Suddenly, those deep blacks turn milky gray, and you see massive halos of light bleeding around bright objects on dark backgrounds. You trade thermal management between the LG G5 and the C5 caught me completely off guard when I finally saw the teardown data. If you've owned any of these for more than a year, tell me if this matches your experience down in the comments. If we stack them up right now, LG gives you the longest physical panel warranty and software support cycle. Sony gives you the cleanest processing and out-of-the-box accuracy, but charges a massive premium. Samsung gives you raw brightness and color volume, but actively fights you with a bloated interface and format restrictions. I keep staring at the data points. Choosing between these three isn't about finding the perfect screen because the perfect screen doesn't exist. It's about deciding which specific flaw you are willing to live with for the next 5 years. I'll give Samsung credit for this one though. The sheer color punch of the S90F is intoxicating, but buying a TV based on a 5-minute adrenaline rush is how you end up miserable in month 40. Let's group these panels by who should actually swipe their credit card. If your living room resembles a greenhouse with massive bay windows and your primary diet consists of Sunday football broadcasts at 2 in the afternoon, skip OLED entirely. The Samsung QN95F Mini LED is your weapon of choice. It physically overpowers direct sunlight, preventing you from squinting to see the score graphic through the reflection of your own couch. Now, if you are the type of person who buys physical 4K Blu-rays because you refuse to accept the compression artifacts of streaming servers, the Sony Bravia 9 or A95L is your endpoint. You are paying a heavy premium for Sony's XR Silicon, but that processor handles 24 frame per second film motion so flawlessly that you never get that terrible artificial soap opera effect. It respects the director's original intent right out of the box. Wait, you're probably thinking, what if I just want the safest place to park my money for the next half-decade without overthinking it? That is where the verdicts land. The best value across the entire market right now is the LG C5. It gives you 4 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, perfect black levels for basement movie nights, and a gaming hub that instantly recognizes your Xbox and optimizes the variable refresh rate. Without you digging through menus, it just works. But the best overall, the absolute king of value retention, is the LG G5. After running the G5 through a simulated 500-hour static image test on my bench, the microlens array thermal dissipation kept the panel surface a full 12-degree cooler than the cheaper C-series. My thermal camera looked at the C5 like it was a toaster oven. The G5 stayed completely relaxed. Here is the debate I want to see you guys fight out down below. Is it actually smarter to spend $2,799.99 on a flagship LG G5 to keep it for 7 years, or should you just buy a $1,000 mid-tier TCL, accept that it will die in 36 months, and throw it in the landfill to buy another cheap TV? Does buying premium actually save you money in the long run, or is that just a lie tech reviewers tell themselves to justify expensive toys? Vote in the comments. I read every single one. Everything I just said, it almost doesn't matter because we need to talk about the real reason. You will hate your next TV. You won't replace your screen because the glass breaks. You'll replace it because the internal system on chip degrades and the software bloats until it takes 5 painful seconds just to open the YouTube application. If you take away anything from this teardown, remember that buying a premium brand isn't just about color accuracy or peak brightness. It's about securing a processor and a memory configuration that won't make you want to throw your remote through the drywall in 2029. I almost didn't include this final thought, but it actually matters more than the specs. Do not buy these panels directly from the manufacturer's site if they charge you return shipping or restocking fees for a bad panel lottery ticket. Always buy from vetted sources with massive no questions asked return windows, or grab an open box model from a local retailer where you can physically inspect the gray uniformity before driving it home. I've put links below to the exact models. And safe vendors I trust for my own lab. Buying a television is stressful because it sits dead center in the room where your family gathers. Take a breath, pick the flaw you can live with, and enjoy the screen.